probably 20 of them that first night, 20 more.
I had no feelings for anybody. If I come in contact with them, they had to die.
Some of them, I'm satisfied, were not good cases, probably should not have been pursued. However, there were enough of them that we could see that we thought he was clearly a serial murderer. The extent of it has always been the question.
Henry, let me ask you first, if you remember, how many murders have you confessed to?
Over 3,000.
3,000?
Yeah. Over 3,000.
You spent a lot of time confessing.
2.5 years.
3,000 murders.
7 days a week. I mean, wasn't all accepted now, don't get me wrong, but that's how many confessions I gave.
By accepted, Henry meant that cops from around the country were, on the basis of his confessions, closing the books on cold cases.
Lucas led lawmen to dozens of murder sites. Lucas's knowledge of the killings was so precise, 15 cases were closed.
She came out of her house and was attacked at the door when she came out.
That's where she was found?
No, she was dragged back in front of the car.
Joyce and Bob Lemon's daughter, Deborah Williamson, was killed outside Lubbock, Texas in 1975.
And she'd been?
Been stabbed 19 times.
19 times.
Mm-hmm.
After years of searching for her killer,
you got a phone call one day.
And they said Henry Lucas had confessed to her murder.
How did you feel?
We were ecstatic. We were excited that this could finally be over.
stories like that of the Lemons help put Henry at the top of the FBI's newest criminal category, the serial killer.
Henry Lee Lucas killed at least 175 people around the country during an 8-year spree.
The more I'd confess, the more they wanted.
Why do you think they did it?
Well, they wanted to make it look like I was the greatest monster that ever lived.
By September of 1983, Henry Lee Lucas was convincing the world that he was America's most prolific serial killer.
I've been trying to stop doing it, and I can't stop.
For 3 months, the 47-year-old Lucas had been spilling his guts to the cops about all the dead bodies left in his wake.
He was a true sociopath. The emotional reaction on his part to what was going on around him was always negligible. But I do think he was a game player. In a sense, the murders that he committed were almost games to see if he could get away with them.
As police began to sort out the unraveling mystery, they wanted to know where such a depraved killer had come from. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in this one-room shack hard on the hillside of Coal Bank Holler in Blacksburg, Virginia.
They were dirt poor.
Aoma Sage is Henry Lee Lucas's niece.
Henry had one full brother and 7 half-brothers and sisters.
She remembers Henry's mother, Viola, as a hard-living mountain woman.
She was at least 50 or 51 years old when she had Henry.
Who brewed her own moonshine and carried a shotgun. She also had an explosive temper. She once beat Henry so viciously that he was unconscious for 3 days. Henry's father, Anderson Lucas, was powerless to stop the abuse.
His name was No Legs. That was everybody knew him as No Legs Lucas because he had no legs. The story was, I mean, as far as we all knew, he lost some of the train ran over him or something. I think he was intoxicated on the train track.
His mother was a prostitute who did tricks in front of him. And sometimes when the mother, when she wanted to bring a trick home, would throw the father in his little cart across the room. Henry had a horrible upbringing.
Well, it's certainly a disturbed and disordered moral situation.
Dr. Richard Coons is a forensic psychiatrist who examined Henry.
Sex was not dealt with in any reasonable kind of way with him. And his mother asking him to watch it or allowing him to watch it, I mean, that's depraved.
And the misery just rolled on for Henry. His brother Andrew added another offense.
Henry and Andrew were in the yard playing. Andrew had a knife, and apparently Henry had made Andrew mad, and Andrew struck him with the knife.
The eye was where it had been damaged, had no pupil, it was just milky white.
Eventually, he got a glass eye that sort of tended to drift away from where the other eye was. So it definitely gave him a distinctive appearance.
In an odd way, Henry's looks suited his emerging personality.
He was just sort of withdrawn, went off to himself. He didn't know how to communicate with the kids, so he would do things to get attention that was just, you know, I don't know if he intended to scare them, but he did.
So he just kind of grew up like a weed. He doesn't have any direction, he doesn't have any goals. His mindset was that of, I want what I want when I want it.
And what he wanted most was to have his mother out of his life. So in 1950, when Henry's father died, drunk, the 14-year-old dropped out of school, ran away from his hometown, and into a life of crime and perversion.
He claimed that he would start torturing and killing animals and having sex with them. He started setting things on fire. Eventually, he moved on to just stealing, and that's what got him into reform school.
At the age of 18, Henry was sentenced to a 4-year stretch in the Virginia State Pen. It was hard time, but ironically, he thrived behind bars.
Really, for the rest of his life, he felt more comfortable in an institutional setting because he did get regular meals, he had indoor plumbing.
When he was released in 1959, Henry left the state. He traveled to Tecumseh, Michigan to live with his sister Opal and try to stay out of trouble. But on the night of January 11th, 1960, trouble came looking for Henry. It was his mother. They met in a bar and started drinking.
I was drunk, and I got in an argument with her in the tavern.
Henry Lee Lucas gave his side of the story to CBS News in 1998.
Because she come in there wanting me to go back home, and I said, I'm not going back with you. I don't want nothing to do with you. So she started pitching a real bitch about it, you know, and then I got up and left the tavern and went on back to where I was living at. And sometime during the night, he come in there with a broom handle and started beating my brains out. And I hauled off and swung at her.
He would never say, I stabbed her in the neck, but that's what he did.
She landed between the bed I was at and the old steel bed over on the other side of the room. And that's the last I remember seeing her.
Henry stole a car and fled to Ohio. An all-points bulletin went out for Henry Lee Lucas, wanted for murder. He was picked up 5 days later in Toledo.
Lucas was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of his mother. Finally, somebody started paying attention to his psychological state, and he was evaluated there in prison.
And for the first time, Henry revealed a shocking secret. He had sex with his mother after she was dead.
He told me, I don't like live sex, I like dead sex.
That was a common theme, really, for all of the time that he spent talking about his killings. He would claim that sex was more appealing to him if the victim, or if the partner, in quotes, was dead.
In 1970, after serving 10 years, 33-year-old Henry Lee Lucas was paroled, an early release due to prison overcrowding. A year later, he was in trouble again, nailed for attempted kidnapping.
There was 3 girls waiting to go to school, and he stopped to ask him if they wanted a ride. And the girls started screaming rape and everything else. As far as I know, he never had done anything with them.
His family may have believed him. The judge didn't. Henry was back in the joint. It was the early 1970s. Rehabilitation was the new buzzword. Instead of hard time, Henry was examined by psychiatrists and social workers who described him as emotionally needy. Cops saw Henry as dangerously manipulative.
He rationalized any action. I mean, he could justify whatever he did or needed to do, and always felt that a lie would get him out of it.
Stuck in prison, Henry was starved for the attention he craved. So when he got a letter from a family friend and single mother named Betty Crawford, Henry latched on. They continued corresponding. In 1975, after his 5-year sentence, they were married.
The night of their wedding, where we stayed at, there was a pull-out bed.
Constance Damron was 7 when her mother Betty brought Henry home.
They were in the bed, and us girls were on the floor in a sleeping bag. And I had been woken up in the middle of the night where he had unzipped his sleeping bag and he was touching me. where he shouldn't have been.
It was the beginning of 2 years of sexual torture, carried on in secret.
He threatened to kill our mother if we told anybody. He was serious. I mean, there was no joking about him.
Eventually, Constance got the courage to stand up to Henry.
And the next day, Henry said he had a job at a mushroom farm in Pennsylvania, and gave my mom a phone number which turned out to be false, and he never came back.
Henry started drifting between family members, persuading them to take him in. A nephew took pity on him and got him a job laying carpet in West Virginia. There he met an 18-year-old single mother, Rhonda Knuckles. From the outset, Rhonda noticed something abnormal about Henry.
He avoided me. He didn't like to be touched. And he would say things to me to scare me. He told me that he was going to cut my heart out. He was going to eat part of it.
The situation reached a boiling point. Rhonda told Henry she was leaving and made a move for the door. Henry pulled out a butcher's knife and forced her back inside.
He had the trash bag that he said he was going to cut me up and put me in, and he put the trash bag over my head. He was trying to suffocate me with the trash bag, but he didn't.
Instead, Henry began to systematically torture Rhonda over the span of 3 days.
At one point, he made me take off all my clothes, and he tied me up. And I thought he was going to rape me, but he didn't. He urinated on me.
Finally, on the 3rd day, Rhonda's friend came knocking on her door. It caught Henry off guard, so Rhonda bolted outside, leaving her baby behind. When her relatives heard the story, they came back with a shotgun. Henry handed over the baby and defended himself in the best way he knew. He lied.
Henry told him that I had lost my mind, that I was trying to kill him and all this stuff, and that he had been taking care of the baby for 3 days. And they believed him.
In 1978, Henry Lee Lucas was living on the fringe of society. He was 42 years old. He'd spent half of his life behind bars. After sexually assaulting his stepdaughter and terrorizing his girlfriend, Henry was on the run. All that's known from this period of his life is what he would reveal in his confessions.
One guy, we shot him, I think, 170-some times.
When did you meet up with others?
75 after I got out of prison.
Henry was talking about this man, Otis Toole.
Otis Toole was a huge, big homosexual man. He was very, very swishy, very gay, but he was also mean. He acted mean and he was tough. He would dress as a woman and then he'd get in a fight sometimes in a bar when they'd make fun of him.
And then, according to Henry's version of things, Otis would haul off and kill the guy. It was the first course, so to speak.
What really got me, though, is when he started eating people. I had to get away from that.
That bad, huh?
That's so most of his victims he killed, he'd cut a piece of them off and eat it. Yeah. I couldn't do it.
The tabloids had a field day with Henry's stories about Otis and their seemingly random murder spree. They called the two the tag team from hell.
To hear Lucas tell it, they just preyed on any female that caught Henry's fancy. You know, killed the woman, and then Lucas would have sex with the body.
Knives was his weapon of choice, and early on I remember him thinking that's more manly. Anybody can shoot anybody, but you got to be good with a knife.
Lucas would brag to me that he never killed a man. He said that anytime they ever killed a man, it would have been Otis Toole that did it.
Prosecutors in Maryland, Michigan, and California collected statements from the two, but there were no witnesses and scant physical evidence. So the cases boiled down to Henry's recollections.
Did you leave anything behind over here on our deal that you can recall?
I doubt it, because we both had rubber gloves on.
In the midst of this cross-country wave of terror, Henry settled in Jacksonville, Florida, Otis's hometown.
Otis Toole was every bit as weird and perhaps even weirder than Henry Lee Lucas. They eventually lived with Otis's parents for a while, and that is where Lucas met Becky Powell, who was Otis's niece.
She was starved for attention. Becky was retarded. Her upbringing wasn't much better than Henry's. She was raised by grandma. Her mama was crazy.
If the two made for a bizarre-looking couple, Henry didn't seem to mind.
I think she actually looked up to Henry almost maybe as a father-like figure to some extent.
I would guess it'd come as close to being the love of his life as Henry could get.
And for the first time since his release from prison, Henry got steady work. He took a job with Otis at a roofing company, fixed cars for people in the neighborhood, and sold scrap metal, all to help keep Becky happy. But Henry would also jealously guard his young lover's time. He kept Becky away from school, the one place where she tried to fit in.
I read some of her school books that she had accumulated somehow, and she'd study, and then she'd give herself a test at the end, and then she'd write her own praises. Very good, very excellent, you know, and that kind of stuff. And it sort of made you sad for her because she was studying the book herself, taking her test, and then grading it herself and telling herself how good she was.
By January 1982, Becky's already meager family life began to fall apart. Her mother had died of a drug overdose. A few months earlier, her caretaker grandmother passed away. Becky was suddenly in the care of two ex-cons, her uncle Otis and his buddy, Henry Lee Lucas. The state of Florida intervened and took Becky to an emergency shelter. Henry was furious. He got word to Becky and convinced her to run away with him.
And they just hit the road and started traveling. Lucas favored the interstate highway system, and they would just drive from place to place.
They would sleep in the car, they would camp out, they drove junkers that other people had abandoned that Henry could fix up and keep going. They came through Houston on I-10 and out towards California, and that's where they met up with Jack Smart.
Jack Smart owned an antique shop. He and his wife Obera took pity on the young couple and offered Henry a job. In May, Obera Smart asked Henry if he would be willing to work for her aging mother, Kate Rich, in North Texas. For Henry and Becky, the plan was a lifesaver. For Kate Rich, it was a fatal mistake.
He pointed to the ground, he said, "If you dig right there, you'll find part of her."
Henry Lee Lucas and his 15-year-old girlfriend, Becky Powell, were tired and hungry when they arrived in tiny Ringgold, Texas in 1982. They were met with a curious but trusting eye by their new employer, 82-year-old Kate Rich. She had recently broken her hip and was struggling to get through her days.
I think she was lonely to a certain extent and welcomed them being there. She'd been through this world and all of its knocks and come out of it.
Henry knew Kate lived on Social Security. Within days, he convinced her to let him take over her accounts in the local stores. It was a big mistake.
They were taking advantage of her, charging at the store, not doing the work that they were supposed to do to fix the place up, things like that.
Kate began to mistrust Henry, but she took a grandmotherly interest in Becky. She noticed Becky was fighting with Henry, begging him to go back to Florida.
Becky just got enough, finally, of the life on the road. I don't know if it was a process of maturation or just simply being homesick to being back in Florida.
Henry made it clear he intended to stay in Texas, despite the problems he was having with Kate Rich's family.
Mrs. Rich's family became concerned about Lucas and thought he wasn't the kind of person that ought to be around her, and they eventually ran him off.
Henry and Becky were back on the highway. Out of the blue, Reverend Reuben Moore of the House of Prayer spotted them in his truck. He brought them home to his religious commune, located on this old chicken ranch.
Henry lived right here, this little section here.
Henry and Becky moved into this chicken coop. It was hot and dirty, but Henry didn't seem to mind. As for Becky, she was starting to unravel. She scribbled a note in her math book. "Dear God, please help me. I am a runaway. She asked forgiveness and added, "Don't let men get used to me or attach." Becky even got in touch with Kate Rich, who encouraged the girl to confront Henry.
She told Henry, okay, I'm going back to Florida. And he made a big show of leaving the house of prayer and saying that he was going to take Becky back to Florida.
Without a plug nickel between them, they started to hitchhike. They made it as far as Denton and turned into this old hobo camp by the side of the road. Henry was drinking.
It's real hot. They sat out there and continued arguing.
We kept arguing and cussing each other, and finally I just told her what we were going back the next morning.
And Becky slapped him, and he just grabbed the knife up and stabbed her.
I just picked it up off the blanket and brought it around, hit her right in the chest with it.
She groaned a little bit, tried to say something. Maybe he stabbed her again, I forget what. But he said it was just reflex.
Henry murdered Becky in much the same way he killed his mother. He was drunk, they were fighting, he reached for a knife and lunged.
And then he said he had sex with Becky after she died.
I guess it got to be a part of my life, having sexual intercourse with the dead.
And then he said he cut her into small pieces, as he put it, and then left and went back to the house of prayer.
He was gone about 24 hours and came back and told them that Becky run off and left him. And he didn't know what to do. He was crying and telling them what happened, and they felt sorry for him.
But one person saw through the lie, Kate Rich. When people at the church told her Becky was missing, she wanted to know what happened. She was asking questions. Henry made a cold-blooded plan to shut her up.
He took her out ostensibly for a ride and ended up stabbing her and then having sex with her body.
Pulled her out the right side, down the embankment, had sex with her. In the road is where we found her glasses. And washed out the other end is where we found the part of her clothing.
He left the body out for a while and then thought better of that and retrieved the body and took it back to his quarters in the chicken coop and cut it up and then burned it in a stove.
Within days of Kate Rich's disappearance, her children filed a missing persons report. When the local sheriff, Hound Dog Conway, heard about Henry Lee Lucas and his long prison record, he knew the little drifter was good for the murder. With Ranger Ryan's help, he brought Henry in on a gun possession charge.
We took him, put him in jail, made a pact not to even talk to him. That was Saturday night, and Wednesday night I get a call that Henry wants to talk. He's passed a note out of the jail.
"I killed Kate Rich," Henry wrote, "and Becky as well, even though he said she was the only girl he ever loved." These first confessions Henry made were credible. Next came a flurry of evil admissions that, as Henry told it, made him America's most notorious serial killer.
What's the youngest one? About a month old. That was accident.
This was a typical Henry Lee Lucas confession.
An accident? I didn't see the baby until it was too late. She had the baby in her arms when I shot her.
It's one of hundreds Lucas gave in the winter of 1983. His stories oftentimes captivated the most hard-boiled police officer.
Out of curiosity, Henry, who did you think you killed?
Hard to believe, but 350.
And Henry seemed as if he was on a mission to fill in the blanks on every last one of them. Lucas had confessed earlier that year to killing his girlfriend Becky Powell and 82-year-old Kate Rich. He was convicted for both murders and knew he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He seemed to be free of any burdens and spent the days producing details of other crimes to share with anxiously waiting detectives.
Everyone that showed up, you know, would say, be careful with him. He'll lie to you more times than he'll tell you the truth.
I showed you this photograph.
Sheriff Jim Boutwell of Williamson County, Texas, was one of the first police officers to seek a confession from Henry.
Jim Boutwell had an unsolved homicide that dated back to Halloween of 1979 when a woman was found dead and nude under a culvert on Interstate 35. The only thing she had on was a pair of orange socks, and they never did identify the body, and so she suddenly became known not as Jane Doe, but as Orange Socks.
We filed a case against Lucas for murder, and at that point in time, Lucas went into more details about the killing.
I drove her like this over here.
Boutwell desperately needed those details to get a conviction.
The second time you had sex with her, she didn't want to. You forced her. Tried to force her, she didn't want to, so then you killed her. That's right.
Well, I killed her. I was already made up my mind to kill her before that.
We alleged there was a murder in connection with a sexual assault.
Although he was twice convicted for murder, this case added the charge of sexual assault, which meant the death penalty. But Henry's attorney, Parker McCullough, had serious doubts about the state's case.
The prosecution's theory was that he picked up this woman in Oklahoma, killed her in Texas, threw her body out north of Georgetown, and then drove like crazy over to Jacksonville, Florida.
When news reporter Hugh Ainsworth heard this, he started digging. He found out that work records placed Lucas in Florida the day after the killing.
How much sense does it make to you to drive 1,200 miles, going about an average of 70 miles an hour to kill someone you didn't even know or didn't know was going to be there? I mean, give me a break.
Ainsworth took a close look at all of Henry's confessions. Meanwhile, as the state prepared its case, Sheriff Boutwell installed Henry in his tiny jail in Georgetown. This was Henry's cell.
What was it like? How'd they treat you?
Better than any king had ever been treated.
Like how?
I had anything I wanted. I had colored TV. I had cases of cigarettes, not just cartons, but I'm talking about cases of cigarettes.
He had a good thing going at the jail. If he wanted more cigarettes, all he had to do was ask for cigarettes. If he wanted more coffee, all he had to do was ask for more coffee. If he wanted another milkshake, all he had to do was ask for another milkshake.
The little drifter had become a star from coast to coast, a human confession machine. Calls poured into Sheriff Boutwell's office from other jurisdictions. To cope with the burden, he turned to the Texas Rangers for help. They created a special Henry Lee Lucas task force. Ranger Sergeant Bob Prince helped coordinate the visiting cops.
We had somewhere around 1,000 officers that were actually there representing a little over 500 agencies. We got all levels. We had them come in and build overalls to T-shirts to, dress very professionally.
The task force asked all incoming detectives to provide them with case files in advance of their interviews with Henry. That was not unusual. What was unusual, according to Hugh Ainsworth, was that Henry was allowed to read over the case files and study crime scene photographs before his interrogation.
And I was even in the office when I saw case files. He'd be sitting at a desk. There'd be 6, 8, maybe only 4 or 5, depending on the day, case files.
Ainsworth wondered if sloppy police work on the part of the Texas Rangers created conditions for investigators like Sheriff Boutwell to obtain valuable confessions from Henry.
He could tell if there's a water tower nearby. He could tell if there was a bridge there. He could tell how the body was placed, And so he convinced a lot of cops around the country that he really did it.
Bob Prince denies any wrongdoing, and there was no evidence the Rangers intentionally compromised Henry's confessions.
We would talk to him about how to handle the interview, what to do, what not to do, mainly what not to do. Don't feed him information. Don't show him photographs. I don't know of anything more that we could have done to ensure the credibility.
Investigators in California pressed ahead anyway. They arranged for a private jet to pick Henry up and fly him to various murder sites around the state. Henry rewarded them with the kind of confessions they could use to sew up their cases.
It must have been incredible to Lucas. After all these years of being a loser, suddenly, he was important. He was being treated very well. They wanted to keep him happy and keep him talking.
Henry talked so much that as the Orange Socks case came to trial, He had been convicted of or pled guilty to 7 murders, all in Texas. Investigators from around the country connected Lucas to at least 175 murders.
They believed that Henry Lee committed those crimes, and they were going to get a conviction for whatever reason.
And when the facts didn't fit the crime, Henry had a convenient answer. He said his old running buddy, Otis Toole, did the job. Otis, who was serving a life sentence in Florida for murder, seemed only too happy to confess.
This was big stuff for them, man. The television cameras were everywhere. The Rangers were flying them around, and they flew Otis over to Texas, and they flew Henry down to Jacksonville. You have to understand, these guys between them don't have 7, 8 years education. One day I got up and I thought, I don't know where this is going to stop.
Maybe it would stop if Henry was put to death. His lawyers in the Orange Sox case were in the absurd position of saving Henry's life by calling him a liar.
I went to Jacksonville, Florida. I found the store clerk who cashed his payroll check at about 6 p.m. on November 1st, which was the day after they had found the victim in Williamson County, Texas.
But in Henry's confession, he claimed his work records were falsified. It was Henry's word against his lawyers.
I strongly believe that he really wanted to help us, but something made him refuse to get on the stand. I think he saw that we were going to make him out to be a phony and a fraud. And for the first time in his life, he was somebody. And all of a sudden, he was about to have that world removed from him.
On April 13th, 1984, 48-year-old Henry Lee Lucas was found guilty, sentenced to die by lethal injection for the murder of an unidentified hitchhiker, known only as Orange Sox. The entire case rested on the sworn statements of a man who'd begun to look like a serial liar.
I was convinced Henry Lee Lucas no more killed that woman than you or I did.
One by one, Henry's other confessions began to unravel. Victims' families faced the painful prospect that their peace of mind had been built on lies.
There wasn't one single thing in his confession that really happened in her murder.
Joyce Lemon spent $100,000 investigating Henry's confession about her daughter's murder.
He said he entered a patio door. He could not have, because there was a big china cabinet in front of it. Said he chased her all through the house. There was nothing disturbed in the house.
The Lemons tried contacting the Lucas task force. No one in authority seemed to be listening.
They hated us.
They hated you?
They hated us.
How do you know they hated you?
Well, for one, they told us.
No, they said we...
They said that we couldn't touch anything they were doing.
They didn't want to stop. They were heroes. They were given badges, they were given guns, they were given honors, Cop of the Year, Sheriff of the Year, Ranger of the Year.
Everybody wanted their time in front of the camera with Henry.
Waco District Attorney Vic Feazell was the next investigator to deal with Henry's confessions. While Lucas had admitted to 3 murders in his county, Feazell wasn't so quick to believe him.
I wanted to find out before I let somebody come in and plead guilty whether or not they'd really done it or not.
Feazell convened a grand jury, and armed with a court order, he forced Sheriff Boutwell to release Henry into his custody.
Our doctors looked at him and took blood tests, and they said this man is on enough Thorazine to knock out a horse. And Thorazine will make somebody very pliable, very suggestible. They'll tell you what you want to hear.
Once off the drug, Henry started singing a different tune.
Suddenly he was a different man. He started saying, yeah, I didn't do that. I didn't do it. I was wondering when somebody was going to wise up to all of this.
Then on April 14th, 1985, the rest of the country got wise to Henry Lee Lucas. A series of investigative reports by Hugh Ainsworth splashed across the front page of the Dallas Times-Herald. The task force, the convictions, the whole 3-ring circus had been based on Henry's evil imagination.
They had not one piece of forensic evidence. Now think about that a minute. They had not one fingerprint, not one hair match, not one piece of fabric, not one thing.
something went wrong. There was not a check somewhere that said, wait a minute, are you sure you got the right person?
I would say maybe I shot her, you know. And they said, no, that's not right, you know. Well, I know it has to be something else. So I would say, well, maybe I strangled her. And that wouldn't be right. So they said, well, no, that ain't right, you know. I said, well, maybe I stabbed her. And they said, oh, yeah, that's right now. That's right.
Henry's recantations were big news. But despite a flurry of negative press and a scathing report by the state's attorney general, little was done. The Henry Lee Lucas Task Force was disbanded. Bob Prince has since left the Rangers, but continues to defend the task force.
In retrospect, in looking at this, of course, many times over the years, I don't know of a whole lot we could do different.
Over the next decade, a handful of Henry's accepted confessions were thrown out, but 214 murder cases were permanently closed. Henry remains the killer of record.
People say to me, well, he's just a dirtball. What in the world, what does it matter? Well, I'll tell you what it matters. If you write off 214 murders, that means 214 murders walk free forever.
You don't ever come to terms with it. You just keep hoping, praying, wishing that one day it'll be done.
Henry was moved to death row. Over the course of the next decade, his lawyers repeatedly tried to get his death sentence overturned. The Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal. Henry's fate rested in the hands of then-Governor George Bush. His office had not issued a single pardon to a death row inmate. Henry was scheduled to die on June 30th, 1998.
I told Governor Bush the guy should never walk the street again, but he also shouldn't die for a crime he did not commit.
Anti-death penalty advocate Rita Radisitz wrote a petition to the Clemency Board in a final attempt to save Henry's life.
And we got a lot of support from victim family members saying that if Henry didn't do the crime, we don't want him executed because he supposedly killed my mom, and if he didn't kill her, I want to know who did. And if they execute him, I'm never going to find out.
4 days before Lucas was scheduled to die, the board issued its decision.
Texas Governor George W. Bush tonight commuted the death sentence of convicted murderer Henry Lee Lucas to life in prison.
It would mark the only time Governor Bush commuted a death row sentence. Henry returned to the general prison population. He was out of the spotlight and unhappy about it. He said he preferred life on death row. On March 12, 2001, Henry died of massive heart failure. The once famous serial killer died a serial liar.
I don't know. It was like he was just seeing how far he could go. You know, will they believe this? Well, I'll add that. Will they believe that? Well, I'll make it even bigger. Well, man, if they believe that, well, then I'll put a cherry on top and see if they believe that.
It is irrefutable that he killed his mother. It is, in my opinion, irrefutable that he killed Mrs. Rich. In my opinion, it's irrefutable that he killed Becky. Lucas was a killer. What is in doubt is how many people he actually killed.